Tzara. So he uses scissors, he cuts up newspaper, presumably current events, things happening in the daily newspaper, puts them in a bag, puts them together, then writes out the poem, and then the last line of this piece called To Make a Dadaist Poem is, and here you are a writer, infinitely original and endowed with a sensibility that is charming, though beyond the understanding of the vulgar. Okay, you are a writer endowed with a sensibility charming. Okay, so then somebody in the forums this week, Susan Thompson, went ahead and did it. Took an article from the New York Times business section. Anybody know what's going on in the Times business section in the last couple of days?
Not dude.
Lily, you've been keeping up.
Yeah, bad things.
Really bad things are starting to indicate, right? So jobs report will be out tomorrow, and there's a slowdown coming, and so the business section is all about that. So Susan Thompson went there, did her thing, put some words in a cup, picked them up randomly, added some breaks. Here's the result. I'll read it. And the question I'm going to ask every one of us, which is to say, going around very briefly to everyone, is, do we learn something from today's news, from this cut-up? Does it have meaning? Could one close read it, etc.? Okay? Is it a poem? Here it is. This is the New York Times, words from the Times. Near experiencing something, people 40, F-O-R-T-Y, people 40 unsettling engine, our time's powerful feeling, behind growth began after run, economic, them new miraculous, and world's China, best most its, that be its, the as, years. Pretty great. Okay, we're going to start with Anna and then Gabe, quickly. Can we read it? Is it a poem? What's it mean?
Well, I don't know what it means, but it's definitely a poem. And I know it's a poem because you contextualize it as a poem. So that question...
So it's a urinal from a hardware store, turn it upside down, sign it situation.
Stuck it in the art museum. Okay, cool, it's art. Like, I don't actually have to debate that.
You're very open-minded about that.
Well, sure. But, like, if you're telling me what I'm about to read you is a poem, then I'm going to take you at your word. And then what becomes interesting is thinking about it as a poem and looking at it as a poem. Mm-hmm. So I'm not interested in having the debate of, is this a poem or not? Like, did the writer intend any of this or not? Like, that question is not interesting to me. What's interesting to me is then applying the things that I know and like about poems to the thing that you've already told me is a poem.
Tzara says it's infinitely original. Agree?
Agree.
Good. Thank you. Gabe, what do you think?
I think the cut-up helps remind you that the language of the thing it comes from is not as natural as it at first seems.
Fantastic. Mm-hmm. I think Erica's there, yes?
Yeah. Erica's there, yeah.
Yep, she's there.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, what do you think?
Absolutely. I feel like there's a huge amount to read and learn from this poem. I heard something like near experiencing something.
Yeah.
I mean,
near experiencing something is the first line.
Yeah. I mean,
pretty
we're
great.
near experiencing something.
I mean, that's pretty great that you could grab randomly words from the Times business section from the floor, and the first line is near experiencing something. It's pretty great, right? Who needs intentional meaning?
Yeah.
For that to happen. I think we've lost Jake. He had to move on. So let's go to Emily Harnett.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a poem. And I think thinking about Anna's question, I'm also not sure what it means. But I think, what do we gain from deciding that it's not a poem, right? We gain nothing. If we say that it is a poem, then we gain something. We gain more poetry, which is certainly more interesting than just reading the worst parts of the New York Times.
Yeah, it's much more interesting than the Times. Lily, then Jason.
For some reason, what this is making me think of is that if you do not buy a subscription to the New York Times, as I do not, but you sometimes want to use it to get your news, and you have reached your monthly limit of number of articles that you can read, sometimes your understanding of what is in the news article is a little more similar to the cut up poem than the full text of the article, because you caught a little bit behind the big image splash that comes up and obscures your view, and like you saw some in the Google search results or whatever. So seems good to me.
I think you and Jason are geniuses. You in addition. And also, you should get the MacArthur Prize.
Well, I'll share it with
No,
you.
I mean, what you just said made me think that I know so little about economics that when I read the business page, I get pretty much this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's as far as I can go.
Sure.
Okay, Jason, then Amber Rose.
I totally agree with Anna that there isn't something that we can point at and call it poetry. It's the act of pointing at it and calling it poetry that makes it a poem.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
pretty powerful, actually, when you think about it.
Yeah, and it's a practice, a way of seeing the world. I mean, can look at, like I'm looking over there, and there's a bag from Honey Grow, and it just says honey, 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 honey.
Honey, 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 grow, grow, grow.
And there's like a little horse standing above it, and that's a poem.
It is. And we'll come back to you and you'll give it a title. Ambrose, this makes me think something, for me, quite radical, for you guys, hardly, I'm sure. But there was a time when you walked around the planet as a human being and you didn't have any control over your identity. That is to say, you were what people thought you were, or you were born, supposedly, or whatever. And you had no control over saying, no, I'd really like to be this. It was also the same era in which a poem had to be a poem, and there were a lot of people patrolling what a poem was and wasn't. Now, I don't know about the relation between those two, but I would say that happily we live in an era where someone can say, well, this is what I would like to be, this is what I would like you to consider me as, think about that thoughtfully, and, by the way, that's a poem, that's a piece of art, and I declare it so. And there's probably some relationship between those two freedoms somehow. Amber Rose, what are you thinking?
Yeah. I think there is some relationship between those things. And I think part of that relationship is about sort of power and who holds it, and this idea that like there is one ideal human, there is one construction of a poem, there is sort of singular meaning and like singular entities that were all powerful, and everything was consolidated, and that's just what it was. And that was sort of based on this idea of exclusion and hierarchy and all of these things. But I think as folks started to sort of make room for other modes of being, it also makes possible claiming and naming other modes for a lot of things, like poems.
Fantastic. Jess, your thought on this?
Sure. It was wonderful to hear that poem, which I think by this point we've established is a poem. And as you read it, it made me think of two things that Stein said or wrote. And the first is from Composition as Explanation, which you said earlier. Al, you've always seen that essay as being very
About contemporary politics.
A political statement and about the now. And as you read that poem, it made me think about the difference between the time of the composition and the time in the composition. So, the practice, right, that went into it, and then the reference, right, or what those words were initially put into circulation to do. So it made me think about that, and it made me think again about something that came into my mind earlier. when we were told, when, you know, it was revealed that none of us are geniuses, which I think is correct.
By someone who's in Thursday already.
Yeah.
But
So-
Eleanor didn't know you in 2013, so
Could still be.
Yeah.
Jess might still be a
Well, I mean, according by the Steinian metric, I don't know. So one of the ways that Stein defined, you know, being a genius, which of
She
course
really thought she
which
was
of
a
course
genius.
she was,
Yes,
right?
oh boy.
Was that being a genius means that you listen and talk at once. And when you read that poem, it made me think about what that means.
Jess, it's so great that you've joined us. You're so wonderful. Thank you.